Ladies and gentlemen, they are. Welcome to the IISS for a discussion today on the Israel-Palestine peace process, prospects for negotiations. As you probably all know, I'm Stephen Simon. I'm Executive Director of the IISS-US and the corresponding Director of the IISS Middle East. I have an office in Bahrain where the IISS has a presence. You're all welcome there whenever you happen to be stopping in Manama. I'm sure that happens fairly frequently. I'm just going to introduce very briefly our two guests. The invitations that you all received via email include their fuller bios, and you're welcome to refresh your memories if you have the text. Daniel Kurtzer was the first commissioner of the Baseball League. He also had some positions in the U.S. government. In more fairness to Dan, he was ambassador to both Egypt and Israel. Many of you probably know that. He was a senior official also in the Near East Bureau at the State Department, where he was a deputy assistant secretary. As a professor, as an academic, he has done a number of very interesting things on the peace process, which I'd encourage you to read. I think they're great books. One is called Negotiating Arab-Israeli Peace, and another is called The Peace Puzzle, America's Quest for Arab-Israeli Peace, and then he was editor of Pathways to Peace, America and the Arab-Israeli conflict. So I urge you to turn to those books for background that I think you'll find useful if you're really committed to this issue. Gaith Lomri, who's immediately to my left, is Executive Director of the American Task Force on Palestine. Did I get that right? He's done a number of things in this context, including as the Director of the International Relations Department for the presidency of the PA, and as advisor to Mahmoud Abbas, Abu Mazen, on foreign policy, which is, I think, the context in which I first met you. He's had a lot of experience as advisor to the Palestinian negotiating team, so he has some practical experience with the subject matter at hand. He participated in the Camp David Summit and Taba. He's a lawyer, educated at Georgetown and Oxford. What we're going to do today, given that we only have an hour, is have our two speakers address this subject for 10-15 minutes apiece. I'm going to start with Gaith Lomri, then we'll turn to Dan, and then we'll have plenty of time for Q&A, which I'm sure will be quite robust. So why don't we just get started right now?
Thank you, Steve. It's a real pleasure being here, and great seeing you twice in the same day, Dan. This is a rare treat. And thank you all for being here. I mean, as you said, I'm a lawyer by training, and so I feel a very strong compulsion to start with a caveat. The caveat here being I'm very much a former PA official. I have not done that for around 10 years, and as you'll see, I have some critical points, but I think I can at least express some of the sentiments and some of the thinking that we see happening in that administration. I'm going to start my timer right now. I think if I were to summarize where we are right now, and I'm going to focus really on this stage of the current negotiations. I would say if I were to summarize where we are right now, I would say we're in a place where there are clearly not going to be any major breakthroughs in the coming weeks. So no expectation of great success, but also a desire to avoid failure. I think the two parties, the Palestinians and Israelis, agree on two things. First of all, they both want to avoid failure. Failure is costly, failure is not good for them. The Palestinians, it's often said that the Palestinians have a plan B, and they do, going to the UN and what have you. Yet this is not a very appealing plan B from the point of view of the Palestinians. It will come with a great cost, as they experienced the first time when they went to the UN. But also, frankly, it does suffer the problem of diminishing returns. The Palestinian public were glued to their TV screens when Abbas went to the General Assembly. I doubt they will be as excited when he goes to the WFP or WHO or one of these other UN agencies. So the political dividend from Plan B is not as appealing. So for the Palestinians, definitely failure is not a preferred outcome, even though success is by no means a foregone conclusion. Yet I think the Israelis and the Palestinians have no desire to go to failure. On the other hand, I think both sides want to avoid agreeing to anything that will leave them vulnerable politically to their domestic constituencies. And this is an inherent problem in the whole framework approach. I do believe the framework approach is a valid one and a valuable one when it comes in diplomatic terms. It will buy us much needed time to synchronize the Palestinian-Israeli timeline with the other timelines in the region, particularly Iran and Egypt. Yet it's very hard to sell it domestically when it's easy to accuse you of making concessions, yet you have nothing concrete to actually fend off and defend yourself. So both sides do not want to be in a place where they will have to agree to anything that will leave them vulnerable. Now I think for Abbas and for the Palestinians, it is clear to them that no matter what they do and no matter how they're going to behave, there are going to be inevitable pushback and inevitable attacks. Hamas will clearly be against them and will attack anything, whether they agree or disagree or say yes or no, they will be attacked. Some elements in Fatah, ones which are clearly identified now in opposition, like Dahlan and some of the others, will be against them. But at least if Abbas can get to a situation where he avoids those who are within his inner circle coming out and using him agreeing to certain things as a way of starting to challenge him and maybe starting the succession debate in earnest, he would prefer to go down that path. Equally, I think Netanyahu is in a similar position. And this is the space in which right now I think the administration can work. There is very little chance for a substantive major breakthrough on the issues, while at the same time there is a great desire to avoid failure. And this gives the administration a number of options. We might end up, as we've been hearing now for some weeks, with a vague document, and indeed every time I talk to administration, the document that or the ideas that I hear are more watered down. One that the Palestinians and Israelis can say yes to, but give their own private reservations. But also, I've been hearing recently even a more watered down version of this, that basically will be, where the Americans will present verbal understandings and the sides will react to these without saying a full yes or a full no. Again, there is merit to this. The merit being the extension of the negotiations right now is necessary for the diplomatic timeline, but also for maturing the issues and building more trust between the sides. On the other hand, there is a risk. And the risk, as I see it, is so far, if I can characterize Netanyahu and Abbas, what they've been really, their behavior has been about not owning this process. If you listen to their speeches, half of their speeches would be praising the current peace efforts, and the other half would be actually casting doubt on them, because I think both of them right now, A, are not certain about success, B, they would prefer this to still be identified as an American-led process, and therefore the failure, if there's a failure, to be an American failure, to be blamed on the other side. And the idea, I think, initially, of having a framework where they will have to have a committed yes to, was in part designed to get them to own this and to avoid this fudging. If you have a vague, generalized statement, then at least you won't achieve this objective. And you will see the sides continuing to behave in the period post-framework in the same way that they have been behaving prior to the framework. Now, no matter what the administration is to present, and no matter what format it will be, assuming the sides will say a yes, even if it's a yes but, One thing for sure is that once they get to this next stage, the two sides will need to go home with some pork. They need to go to their publics and to say that we have something to deliver besides this vague diplomatic document that was never really intended to be implemented on the ground, and therefore will have no direct relevance to your average Palestinian, or for that matter, your average Israeli. And so both sides would need some things to take home with them, and I think this is what we saw. I can't speak about the Israelis. I don't know enough about them to speak about it, but I can talk about the Palestinians. I think a lot of what the recent meeting between Obama and Abbas was about was specifically this. You want extension of the negotiations? What do we get out of it? And so we saw some ideas being presented. I know Abbas presented, for example, in the meeting, a list of high-value prisoners that he wants released, Marwan Barghouti and some of those other guys. The issue of settlement freeze came up, what have you. Now, these, I believe, are just an opening bid. And what we will see in the coming couple of weeks is a back and forth whereby the Palestinians will have to find out how far the US and Israel are willing to go, and to see if this is enough for them to continue with the negotiations. One thing that is clear, that will be in any incentive package, and has to be in any incentive package, is on the one hand, economic assistance. This is needed for the Palestinians because of the current economic crisis, but also there will be a need for some Israeli loosening of things on the ground, because otherwise it's going to be very hard for Abbas to continue justifying ongoing negotiations. Once he agrees to a framework, he will be in a situation where he'll be under a protracted attack from his detractors, and he will have to show something in return for it. As I said, I am sure that the Israelis have their own set of issues that they would want. In the long term, though, while some of these immediate deliverables are good to give you a spike in the popularity and a spike in the polls for a week or two, the Palestinians will continue to suffer. The Palestinian negotiators will continue to suffer from a problem of legitimacy, or at least credibility, among their public. And they will have to contend with this. Now, one way, of course, of dealing with legitimacy from them would be to produce a convincing peace deal. Yet we understand that this is not possible in the short term. This is something that will have to come at the end of a longer process. So we'll have to start looking for other formats whereby they will have to bolster their legitimacy. And I think this is where attention should be paid to some of the domestic policies that need to start being implemented, or at least enhanced, in the Palestinian Authority. And I think as we in the United States offer them some short-term incentive and some short-term cushioning, we have to also engage with them on ways of bolstering their long-term credibility, and this will have to be through a return to the Palestinian institution building reform process that was initiated some years ago, which seems to have suffered some setbacks in recent months. And this is true both on the security sector, which is key not only, I think, for the Israeli interest, but also for the Palestinians' own internal legitimacy, but also in the governance sectors and in the financial transparency and what have you, but ultimately also in the political sphere. And the idea of election, while it might not be possible in the immediate and short term, should not be one that will have to be taken off the table. In conclusion, and someone asked me when I was walking in, am I going to be the optimist in this panel? I don't actually, I don't like to think, I'm going to plagiarize from Marwan Muashar this morning. I say I don't want to look at it as a pessimist or an optimist. I don't think that these are the right categories. I think that we have a very complicated political situation. One that, if we were to fail, would explode in all our faces. Yet we have options for something that is much lower than what we were hoping for initially, yet something that is, in diplomatic terms and in a peace process terms, actually might be quite valuable to give us some wiggle room. This is a question where, I've actually done my 10 minutes. This is a question where, this is a moment where policy and diplomacy come into tension with politics, and the thinking and the planning and the behavior we expect to see, and I would like to see in the coming few weeks, would be how to get politics on the same line as policy and diplomacy to enable the sides to continue with this process and enable them to avoid failure while at the same time not leaving them vulnerable to very real domestic political challenges.
Thank you.
Thank you, Steve, for the kind introduction. When I told my grown sons that I had been appointed Commissioner of Baseball, they said to me it was about time I did something useful with my life, which may be a comment on what they think about baseball, but also maybe a comment on what they thought about the 30 years in which I worked on the peace process. What I want to do is look at this past year and suggest that it's been a year of both tremendous surprise and a year of potential disappointment. The tremendous surprise is why a Secretary of State in a second-term presidency would wake up one morning and decide to invest as much time and attention as he has done. In fact, more time and attention than any other Secretary of State since James Baker back in the days of the George H.W. Bush administration. And that's been a pleasant surprise. For those of us who have devoted considerable time and attention to the peace process, seeing such high-level intervention by the Secretary of State, and then seeing the breadth of coverage in which the Secretary was prepared to imbue this peace process was quite heartening. After all, Secretary Kerry did not simply try to bring the parties back to the negotiating table, which has been a mantra of American diplomacy, but rather sought to build a little bit of what might be called an infrastructure before asking the parties to negotiate. And so he invited the Arab foreign ministers to Washington about a year ago to bring back into the picture the Arab Peace Initiative, quite important in terms of both American diplomacy and also diplomacy in the peace process. He asked, or the President asked, General John Allen to revive the efforts that had been started by General James Jones to look at the security requirements that the parties, particularly Israel, would face in the context of a peace settlement, and to see whether or not there were answers to the issues that would be raised. The Secretary joined the World Economic Forum's economic initiative, promising something like $4 billion of investment in a Palestinian state to ensure that it wouldn't be a failed state. And he encouraged the private sector in Palestine and Israel in their effort to build the initiative called Bridging the Impasse, in which the private sector sought to tell the policymakers what to do rather than the other way around. Having built this infrastructure, further heartening to those of us who've watched this process, the Secretary said he's then going to try to build a negotiating process that is designed to succeed and not simply to keep, in the phrase that became renowned in the 1990s, to keep the bicycle pedaling. In other words, this wasn't a process designed to be a process. It was supposed to be a process leading to conclusions. And that's where we came to this idea of a framework agreement that would somehow capture enough of the two parties' positions that they could then enter negotiations on a strong enough basis to make those negotiations sustainable. And then you end up with this second factor, which is the potential disappointment. As they've suggested, we've reached a point where people are now giving serious thought to anything but a strong framework. They suggested one idea of a watered-down document, not his idea, but one that may be in the atmosphere, or perhaps no document at all. And what this really tells us is that whereas the infrastructure or substructure of this process that the Secretary constructed was so sound, when you finally get to that point in which the parties are asked to negotiate peace, they may be launched into a failed process. Because after all, there are two things that we have learned from history, and now teaching at a university, I know both the benefits of studying history and also the limitations of trying to draw historical lessons. But there are two lessons that in this peace process we've learned. One is that you cannot get a strong document agreed in advance of negotiations. We tried it in 1991 before the Madrid Peace Conference. We tried to develop a strong set of terms of reference. And it wasn't until Secretary of State Baker actually announced the conference in mid-October that it became a quote-unquote agreed document because the United States put it out as the letter of invitation. Had we tried to get everybody to agree to every word and every concept, we would still be negotiating to get to Madrid. So the first thing you learn is, and we hope the Secretary is not trying this, is that you can't get these two parties to agree to strong terms of reference, because if they could agree to strong terms of reference, they would have had peace already. They would have made the hard decisions on the substance of negotiations that are required even to get to a document, a framework document. And secondly, there is no possibility of success in the negotiations without strong terms of reference. So to launch a negotiation on the basis of a watered-down framework or some verbal United States understandings of the positions is to basically fate this process to fail. And when it fails, you're going to be left with the proverbial question of on whose doorstep the dead cat is left. And so you do have this idea that neither side wants to be blamed for failure. Both sides want to avoid the possibility that they will have to say no. And so they will begin to put pressure on the administration to move into a direction of a watered-down document that will at least get them through this next phase, but will assure the ultimate failure of negotiations. Now, this makes no sense. It makes no sense for a United States that is not serious about a peace process, which may have characterized our policy in the last decade. And it certainly makes no sense for a United States that now says it is serious about a peace process. Because if you are serious about a peace process, you must be serious about strong terms of reference, and you must be serious about not letting the negotiations fail because the parties are prepared to say no. We should not accept no for an answer. So there's an alternative. And the alternative is either the United States walks away. There's the idea, you give the two parties the phone number of the White House switchboard, and you say to them, when you're really serious, give me a call. Of course, they're not going to call. Or if, in fact, you've invested the kind of time and attention that the administration has invested so far, you put out a strong framework. Not necessarily an agreed framework. Not a framework that the two parties have negotiated, because they can't negotiate a strong framework, but a strong enough framework that suggests where they would get to if they became serious. And so you end up appealing, in a sense, above the heads of the two leaders to those parts of the publics in Palestine and Israel that consistently tell the pollsters that they're prepared for a fair but challenging peace. When you see the polls that are conducted in both constituencies that lay out the kinds of trade-offs that need to be made, in other words, you can't do this issue by issue, because on each issue, both constituencies will adopt a hardline position. But when they see that both sides are going to have to compromise and take hard decisions, they end up supporting the idea of peace in large numbers. It was amazing to see that during the Intifada. It's equally amazing to see it today, 10 years later, or 7 years, 8 years later. So the reality is a strong American framework which says to the parties, we know you can't say yes to this right now, but we want you to negotiate on its basis now, and which leads them in a direction which is healthy in terms of where they have to go, almost like a funnel where you start at the wide end and you narrow that funnel as those parties move down towards that agreement, with the United States playing a strong role, makes the most sense of all. Now, the question that's raised is twofold. Number one, what if they actually do say no and they decide to walk away? Well, it's our policy. We do have the ability and the right to have an American foreign policy. And we have never articulated a strong idea of the way this conflict can end. And why not? We're in 2014. We do have an idea how it can end, and it's not very far from the way the two publics see the conflict ending. So we can now adopt an American position, not on all of the details. We don't have to determine the exact location of the border or the exact idea of where security forces will be located, but a framework that's strong enough to say to the parties, this is the way it's going to look. Now you color in according to the color by numbers method, and you fill in those details. Now the second question that emerges is, well, what about the domestic politics here? After all, the president has a few other things on his agenda. Does he want to have a fight with both Palestine and Israel, or just Israel, at a time when he's got so many other things on his agenda? And I would suggest, and I would love to hear an alternative view, because I'm not an expert on domestic politics, that the midterm elections are not going to be won or lost on the basis of whether the president puts out a strong framework in the Middle East peace process. It's not going to make one whit of difference whether or not the president becomes bold and decides that we can do the diplomacy that we used to do, or whether or not the president decides to walk away. And if that's the case, that there is no real domestic downside to a strong policy, then having committed what we've committed over the past year, and knowing what we know about the possibility of what may be out there if we put a strong framework forward, I see no downside to doing so. So my suggestion would be, don't think about plan Bs and plan Cs. Don't think about fallback positions. Go to Washington, where we are today, and say to our administration, where I have focused all my attention during my government service and since I've gone to the academy, let's have a strong policy for a change. And let's say to the parties, this is how we think this process can move forward. Now, it just so happens that I have proposed such a framework. And should you decide to purchase the book, Pathways to Peace, you can see it. And if you don't want to purchase the book, you can also see it online. The point is, I don't know if it's better or worse than anybody else's framework, but the reality is that we are smart enough and we have done diplomacy well enough in the past to put together a strong idea of how to get these parties to make peace, and we ought to do that today. Thanks.
Well, thank you very much. I think the best thing to do right now is to open us up to Q&A. We've got about 30 minutes. I expect there'll be a lot of questions. I've got a few of my own that I'll reserve for the end of the session if there's time. I just ask you, we do have microphones around, that's correct, yeah. I just ask you, when you want to ask your question, that you stand, if you can, and tell us who you are and what your affiliation is. Look, I don't know, I get to times during the day when I just can't budge, so I'm just giving other people the benefit of the doubt. Okay, so let's commence. Who would like to ask the first question? Sir.
Hi, my name is Harry Reese. I'm a research assistant at the Washington Institute. I'm a research assistant at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. My question is for whomever would be moved to answer it. It's about how the Arab awakening and the Syrian civil war has affected the Palestinians in their strategic calculations about peace as opposed to previous rounds of negotiations.
There is, I would say, no causal linkage, there is no direct linkage as such. But the effect that we see actually relates more to the, I don't know what's the right word, the geostrategic or some of the regional kind of diplomatic developments. Particularly, I think the Palestinians right now find themselves in complicated situations on two fronts. One is there's no Egypt. There is no Egypt to go to. And when we were negotiating in the past, there was also, we always relied, when things got tough, the Egyptians were a good conduit to the Israelis and the Americans. And when we were kind of saying no, the Egyptians can always come and twist our arms and kind of make us be a bit more reasonable and what have you. Right now there's no Egypt in the, and that has made it very difficult to move on. But also, as importantly, I think with the Arab preoccupation with other issues, this issue has become not as much of a priority. And many of the Arab leaders are not willing to expend political capital that is needed to engage in this. And thirdly, I would say, not Arab awakening really, but kind of relevant to that, which is the issue of Iran. I mean, Israel has its own concerns when it comes to this, but frankly, right now for the Gulf, for Saudi in particular, but for the Gulf in general, the issue of Iran, first of all, is the most important issue, and that's where most of their interest is. But also, going back to this perception that this is primarily an American process, one that's led by the US, it is seen right now as a nice arena to do some proxy bargaining with the United States. Kerry, you want us to come and be proactive in supporting this one? Well, what are you going to give us on Iran? So I see these kind of linkages coming here, but there's also a more overarching issue that actually goes to the point that you raised, Dan, about that. There is a sense right now in the region, rightly or wrongly, but I think it's a very strong sense, that this US administration is not a strong one. Not one that can be relied on, and one that can frankly be ignored at very little, if any, cost. And therefore, there isn't this kind of, when you had Baker running this, you had a very different perception of Baker and of Bush and of the United States. Right now, there is a much lesser awe, if you wish, of the US. And this is where, by the way, my biggest fear with your proposal, Dan, is you put it out there, the sides say no. First of all, this is not good for the US. First of all, they think it's easy for them to say no. Secondly, I think we do not need another perceived failure in the region, and so I think there is a certain risk. I'm not saying that I wouldn't go for this, but I would say that to go to this, you would need a very heavy, serious diplomatic process of lining up the other players and a good deal of carrots and a bigger deal maybe of sticks.
I would agree. I would not enter my own suggested process if you're not prepared to take it through to its conclusion. And the expectation has to be that the parties are not going to be happy with what the United States puts out. If we're not prepared to stick with it and not take no for an answer, then don't get into it. But if we are prepared to stick with it and act in ways that are commensurate with what I think is still our diplomatic power, then I think it's useful to think about this. I'd add two other points relative to what Beth said in terms of the question. Yeah, you remember in 1992, Yitzhak Rabin, and then in 2002, then Crown Prince Abdullah, thought about the necessity of resolving the Arab-Israeli conflict so as to be able to focus on the real threat to both Israel and the Arab world, and that was the emerging threat of Iran. Now, you fast forward the clock, it's 12 years after the Arab Peace Initiative was first launched. We haven't made much progress in resolving the Arab-Israeli conflict, and the Iran factor in regional politics is extraordinarily important. So if it was smart to resolve this conflict 20 years ago because of the Iran factor, and 10 years ago because of the Iran factor, isn't it even smarter to resolve it today? And it makes no sense to think that because there happens to be some turmoil in the Arab world, that that's a time to hunker down. It seems to be just the opposite. Because of turmoil in the Arab world, it's a time in which Israelis and Palestinians might be able to actually solve their problem, get this issue off of the agenda, and allow everybody to focus on the strategic issue, which is how Iran relates to the rest of the region.
You're going to have a microphone in just a second.
Toby Gotti used to be at the State in the White House. I have an observation. The first is that there are only 24 hours in a day and there are other crises in the world. That's not a surprise. Let me talk about one in specific, the Ukraine crisis, which is could impact this process in various ways, and I wonder how you think it might. For example, we had a memorandum, Budapest memorandum, that we're supposed to provide security guarantees or something for Ukraine in terms of giving up its nuclear weapons. Obviously, nobody's doing anything to implement that. I guess it's to be expected. There's going to be a lot of money needed to bail out Ukraine. There's also a lot of money needed to help with Palestinian economic development. And Russia may not be willing to be as cooperative if you think they were cooperative. Will this increase insecurity in the region, or will it have no impact? Iran, Syria, whatever.
I guess that's for you.
Yeah. Look, I'm very sympathetic to the idea that, especially when a crisis emerges, everything else seems to get crowded out of the agenda. But if that's the case, then we ought to hang up our superpower spurs and decide that we're no longer able to walk and chew gum. You know, years ago we developed the 2.5 war strategy. The idea being that you don't have the luxury when you're a major world power of only focusing on one military combat situation at a time. We don't have that luxury in diplomacy either. Now, had you asked this question before John Kerry became involved in the peace process, I think there would have been an interesting debate. Should he have devoted the kind of time and attention to this issue that he has devoted? Now that he has devoted that time and attention, without pursuing this seriously to a success, it'll only add to the perception of American weakness. And Ukraine plays into it in a very direct way. What did General Ya'alon, the Israeli defense minister, say that aroused Washington's anger? He talked about our weakness. Now, Ya'alon may have an idea that every problem is a nail and we have a hammer, whatever that phrase is. You know, we ought to be sending in the 82nd Airborne. No, he's wrong. But the idea is that if the perception grows that we are not able to focus on a variety of crises and to deal with them, including one where we have invested substantial time already in the past year, then yeah, we are a weak power. And I don't believe that we are. So I would say, yeah, for sure, Ukraine is the immediate issue on the agenda. Secretary-President had to devote a lot of time to it. But you got a lot of people in the State Department and the White House who can also focus time and attention on this other issue if they get the direction of the President to do so. And that's going to be the critical issue.
In a similar vein, I would say, look, the story about the Ukraine, as read in Arab newspapers, and as I often hear it even from fairly senior Arab officials, is the following. You know, we failed to back our red line on Syria, which made Putin decide to go and invade the Ukraine. Clearly, it's oversimplistic, what have you, but it tells you a sense of the general mood. There's a sense that we've already hung the spurs in some ways, and everyone's looking at Ukraine. Will we be able to handle this one effectively, decisively, in a strong fashion? At which point, you know, we might be looked at more seriously, or would this be a reaffirmation that we are incapable of doing things? Now, acting decisively, I mean, I don't know anything about the Ukraine, but I know that acting decisively in this case doesn't mean you go and start a war. But there are indications that there are people are really reading between the lines to see how effective we are and how capable we are of deploying. What I agree with you, formidable diplomatic and military and what have you power, but are we willing to use it or not is the question that people are looking at in the region.
I can't see what row you're in, and both of you have beards, so I can't say the one with the beard, but maybe the one sitting more in, yes.
Thank you. Yves Raymond from the Swiss Embassy. The current process is a process led by the United States. My question now is, what's the role for the international community, for the other countries? What could they do? What should they do? What should they not do? Any hints?
I mean, if I might start by actually giving very, great credit to Kerry on managing the multilateral dimension of this. I think the way he has not only brought the Arab foreign ministers here, but consistently, systematically made sure that they are briefed in a regular basis. The degree of engagement with the Europeans, I think, has been quite sustained and quite effective. So in that regard, I mean, I would have to first of all just point out to this as, testament to his skill. And as I see it, the role of the world, I would focus on two specific regions, the Arabs and the Europeans. The Arabs are indispensable, not only at the kind of once we sign and you need them to stand back there in the background and clap and have the big fat checks. You need that, clearly. But also, you need them during the process. And I think we have learned this in Camp David, in terms of the connections that we made with our attempt to mobilize the Arabs at the last minute. We need them, again, because sometimes you need, the Arabs can say things to the Palestinians that no external power can say as convincingly. and we need them to play this role on an ongoing basis. So I think for the Arabs, you certainly need that kind of role. Don't just put them on the shelf and say, we'll bring you once everything is ready. They have to be engaged because certain things that only they can do vis-a-vis the Palestinians. The Europeans are playing a very interesting role. I look at what Merkel and what Cameron did when they went to Israel, and I thought that was brilliant. On the one hand, clearly gushing with love and warmth to Israel. We love you, we emphasize, we support you, you are there, you have a right to be there, and all the right things that Israel has to hear, and it's important for Israel to hear. Yet also, we're saying, look, we're not going to put up anymore with some of the prices of the occupation, and a price will have to be attached to that. So I think that's a very interesting role the Europeans are developing for themselves. But I would add something else as well. We always look at the role of the United States, and many of us in the Palestinian and pro-Palestinian community, lament that it's not an honest broker, and we want the U.S. to exert more pressure on Israel. And I do believe that there has to be more, if you wish, tough love between the U.S. and Israel, and the love bit is a real bit. It's not adding it as an addendum. It's the nature of the war relationship and the complete trust the Israel has with the U.S. is what allows the U.S. to be effective when it comes to Israel. I would submit that I would like to see a similar role with the Europeans vis-a-vis the Palestinians. We're there, we support you, we have a track record of that, and we'll continue supporting you. But for heaven's sake, start, be a bit more reasonable in this bit and that bit. If we have this division of labor, where the traditional allies of either side, without breaking the fundamentals of the alliance, are willing to be more proactive in pushing the sides beyond their comfort zone, I think we would have a great division of labor there.
Speaks for itself.
That's right.
Back of the room.
Thank you very much. Jim Shear, formerly Office of the Secretary of Defense. As you certainly have seen, I suspect, Tom Friedman interviewed Mahmoud Abbas some weeks ago, and Abbas proposed the idea of a U.S.-led NATO third-party peacekeeping force. Hamas and Netanyahu both voiced skepticism of that, and Secretary Kerry has sort of said, well, that's something for the parties to work out. So to both of our panelists, what's your impression? How realistic is the Abbas proposal, and how might it morph into something which both sides could accept as part of the larger transition process where the Israeli Defense Force would have to transition out of sovereign Palestine? Thank you.
The traditional way of looking at this peace process has always been you bend towards Israel on security, and you bend towards Palestine on governance, territory, identity. So on the question of security, one of the reasons I think that General Allen was brought into this process was to look exactly at these kinds of issues. Now, we know that the Israeli position under the Netanyahu government is fairly rigid with respect to its own demands that it maintain an Israeli presence, let's say along the Jordan River, on certain hilltops in the West Bank, certain early warning stations. And one of the objectives of Allen has been to see whether or not some combination of alternatives might serve the same purpose in a process that's going to evolve over time. So on day one, in fact, there may be Israeli forces that remain in certain places. By day 3 years or 5 years, maybe they start to transition out in favor of some of these alternatives, some of which are going to be quite intrusive and extensive over a long period of time. So I think what John Kerry was saying in shorthand is, when he says, the parties need to work it out, this is going to be one of the most complicated aspects of the process. Defining a border is a political and cartographical problem, but it's not an insurmountable problem. This, security, how do you replace what has become a comfort area for the Israeli Defense Forces and the Israeli government? How do you replace that with something in which there are no Israeli forces in the Palestinian state? Is going to be far more complicated. But Kerry, I think, believes it's a doable proposition.
I think that bringing in Alan was one of the most brilliant things that were done. At the end of the day, when you have a four-star, he's a four-star, former head of NATO, arguing certain things with the Israelis on security is much more credible when you have, you know, someone like myself, a human rights lawyer with 3 months military training. It's actually resolved many of the issues that in Camp David and elsewhere we were unable to resolve, just by sheer logic. Yet, I mean, I would agree with you. Look, the problem with the Jordan Valley, or the Jordan River in particular, to be more accurate, is not primarily a security problem. I think as General Allen and his staff described their proposal, they're proposing what will be the most secure and, yes, the most expensive border on earth. So from a security point of view, we've gone as far as we can possibly go. The question is a question of trust and comfort zone. And I think this goes back to the question of how can we, as we go in there, make sure the Israelis are comfortable enough with an arrangement there that they can feel that they can give up some of their security concerns, and this is where the U.S. and the special U.S.-Israel relation might come in extremely handy.
Mike Bernstein, I'm a partner at Arnold Reporter here in Washington. Sorry, thanks. Well, what do you think has happened in the administration that's changed the level of involvement and commitment to the process?
I think there are two things. One, I think John Kerry, after 35 years in the Senate, understood that this was a critically important issue. You know, we talk about it being critically important. General Petraeus talks about it being critically important. A lot of people talk about critically important, and yet presidents and secretaries of state have not treated it that way. Kerry now has the chance to actually work on it, number one. Number two, I think in the context of the response I gave earlier about is this the right time to be doing this in the context of Arab Spring, I think Kerry understood, yes, this is the right time to do so. I was on a panel in Israel in June at the Paris Presidential Conference in which the panelists were asked, should Israel hunker down or take the initiative? I was the only non-Israeli on the panel, which was comfortable because you get 4 Israelis on a panel and you can just sit back and let them argue, which is exactly what they did. I had Dory Gold on one side and Mayor Dagan on the other side, and they really represented the two polar opposite views of answering that question. Dory Gold saying, no, it's the worst time to do anything. The region is aflame and everything's ablaze and we shouldn't do anything at all. And Mayor Dagan, actually building off something I said, which is if you stick your head in the ground like an ostrich, you expose another part of your anatomy, basically said, no, it's exactly the right time to do it, because if the region is in a weakened state vis-a-vis your security, you can fix your problem inside your house, as it were, and now present, even if you're taking risks with respect to withdrawal from territory and some of the security issues, it's better to do it. And I think Kerry has understood this, that this is not a problem, it's an opportunity. Now, you can disagree with them, as many in Washington have disagreed with Kerry. There has been, over this past year, what I've come to call the Washington consensus. The people who say, oh, it's too hard, oh, we may fail, oh, we have other things to do, we shouldn't bother with this, just do maintenance, maintain the process over time. Kerry doesn't believe in that. Kerry thinks that he can actually make enough progress to effect a change that becomes a game changer, if I could use that word, that ill-advised word. So I think a lot of it has to do with both the history as Kerry has understood it and the president has understood it, and Kerry's appreciation of a moment in which an opportunity has presented itself for the United States to try to exploit it.
I agree with you. It's what changes two words, John Kerry, which actually, I mean, I agree with all the positive side of it, but it raised one concern. Again, Palestinians and Israelis are skilled. I remember when I was there. Bring us a new American, and we will try to find, can they deliver? Do they have the backing of their boss? All of that. We know how to test it. And right now, I think, at least initially, the question that I used to get asked most from people back there is, does the president support Kerry in this one? Does he have his back? And frankly, the way that Syria was managed, the whole optics of it, went to reaffirm the negative answer to this. And I have not been briefed, significantly on the meetings that happened, but I suspect and I do hope that what we saw is clear, support by the president to his secretary and willingness to do what it takes. I mean, Baker was brilliant. As a secretary, he was brilliant. But also the fact that everyone knew 100% that what he said was basically what the president said. There was no daylight between the two, to use a common phrase these days. I think this is one of the risks inherent when you have a policy where the only real difference is a committed secretary of state. You need such a secretary, but you have to prove clearly beyond doubt that he has the support of his boss.
Is there a Palestinian leader who can recognize a Jewish state and survive?
It depends how you put it. It depends on what context you put it. It depends on what you get in exchange for it. I personally believe that bringing issues of identity into the negotiation realm is ill-advised. I had the misfortune of being the guy who was asked in Taba to go and draft a joint understanding with the Israelis on what happened in 1948. And try to imagine trying to reduce your narrative. Forget agreeing with the other side. Reduce your narrative to 2 paragraphs of legalese and see how politically viable that is. So I believe personally that bringing the issue as a negotiation issue is ill-advised. Yet, if you want to put it on the table, then I suspect there will have to be, the Palestinians will ask for something in return. And traditionally what we've been hearing recently is recognizing Israel as the state of the Jewish people versus Palestine of the state of the Palestinian people. That's not what Palestinians will ask for, because that's not the parity in their mind. In their mind, accepting Israel as a Jewish state in legal terms means accepting the legitimacy of the Zionist narrative of what happened in 1948, and in exchange they would want the Israelis to accept the legitimacy of their narrative. So what they will be asking for, I suspect, in this would be the Israeli recognition of Israel's part in making the refugee tragedy of 1948 and what have you. Now, if we have these two, if the leaders think that this is something they want to tackle, by all means, all I would say is that this will leave them both very vulnerable to huge constituencies. That said, I actually think that there are other things that can be done to address these concerns vis-a-vis the Israelis. I believe and I know for a fact that Abbas himself, as well as other leaders, have been known to publicly recognize the Jewish connection to the land, have publicly recognized that the Jewish people as a people have a strong relation to the land, all of it, and to Jerusalem and what have you. Mentioned some of the religious underpinnings of this view. The mention of Bani Israel, the Israelites in the Quran and what have you. So I think there's a lot, much can be done in the public messaging sphere in order to allay each side's fears about the legitimacy of their positions in the eye of the other. Yet I don't believe that it can be negotiated. I think we Palestinians and Israelis have become addicted to negotiations. Give us anything and we want to negotiate it. I think negotiation is not the only available conflict resolution tool, and we have to be a bit more creative when it comes to this.
I would just add one thing, and I disagree a little bit with Vaith on this, because what he tended to do in his answer was to define the way the Palestinians have defined the question, which is fair, but the reality is we don't know how the Israelis have defined the question, because they've put out an idea, but we don't know what they really want. And at this point, I tend to think back to my time as ambassador in Israel. Ariel Sharon was the prime minister for 4 years while I was there. And he used to say the same thing as you're hearing today, which was, with a nuance, he said he would not be convinced that peace was at hand until he was persuaded that Palestinians and Arabs had come to accept the legitimacy of the Israeli state in the historical homeland of the Israeli people. That's a different way of formulating an issue as opposed to a negotiating problem. Once you make it a negotiating problem, well then, what do you want? Do you want the words? Do you want to say the words Jewish state? Because if that's what you want, There are 100 ways to do that that, frankly, I think could be acceptable to Palestinians. It says it in the 1947 partition resolution. You can quote from that. You can find a lot of ways to do it, and you're a lawyer, so, you know, I turn to you. Come up with some of those ways. But that's not the issue here. The issue is for the people of Israel, they're looking for some psychological assurance that they're not there by default, that they're accepted as an integral part of a region because they have a historical homeland connection to the region. And I don't know, I assume the Prime Minister has something that he has thought about in his mind, but he hasn't articulated it. So, throwing it into negotiations either as a precondition or as a formula, I think has been a disservice. And it's been an equal disservice for Palestinians to respond to that by saying, no, we'll never do it. Of course you're going to do it at some point because you've already done it in the past. There are all kind of books and articles about, tourist guides, tourist books and so forth in the 1920s that talked about the Jewish connection to the land of Israel and Palestine. It's a ridiculous issue once you try to define it in negotiations. We're talking more about psychology here, which, as Gates said, requires you not to put it into negotiations, but to deal with it some other way.
Back to you.
David Schoenbaum, I'm a retired professor from the Middle West, which is not the Middle East. No one has mentioned Gaza. I wonder if someone might like to, and if so, how? I wonder if someone might mention Gaza and whether it makes things better, worse, matters, or doesn't matter.
I would answer your questions at three different angles. If you look at Gaza as a matter of, as a negotiation matter, then this is pretty straightforward. No Palestinian leader, whether it's a Hamas leader or a Fatah leader or another leader, can ever accept a Palestinian state that doesn't include the West Bank, Gaza, and East Jerusalem. I have no doubt that Hamas would be happy to kind of declare an independent government in Gaza or state in Gaza. They just can't because that's politically unviable. So a negotiated deal, the map will include the West Bank and Gaza. The implementation will be you implement where you can, and that's a different story. If you look at Gaza, as many often do, conflating Gaza and Hamas, then I think that's a mistake in doing this. I am a strong believer in isolating Hamas, in squeezing Hamas until it meets the international conditions, the quartet conditions, the US legal conditions. I've always been a holder of that view, yet I do not believe that Gaza is Hamas, and I think that the more that we impose a closure, a siege, a blockade, I don't know what's the right term, on Gaza, the stronger we make Hamas, and the more that we destroy the middle class in Gaza, that if you're going to expect change to come, it will come from that middle class. So I'm very much for opening up on Gaza without jeopardizing Israel's real security concerns. Easier said than done, but in my view, not impossible, and there have been enough security and other studies done in terms of how to do that.
Okay, we've got just a little less than 5 minutes, and I thought I'd ask a question of each of the panelists. I've jotted down about a dozen questions. I think to Dan, my question would be, and focusing on the subject at hand, which is prospects for Israeli-Palestinian negotiations. I think you have a suspicion or a concern that where the current process is going is in the direction of a weak, watered down framework, as Gabe put it. Given the tremendous conviction that Secretary Kerry is bringing to this process, and given, I think, the logical irrefutability of your proposition that there isn't a whole lot to lose by putting forward a strong framework and leaving it to the parties to decide, if it is tending toward a weak outcome, a weak framework, why? How do you reconcile that with Kerry's commitment? I'll save my question for you in a second.
Well, I think the simple answer, and I don't have any inside knowledge, so I'm speculating along with you here. Thank you for all coming. I think the logic here is that having taken this proposed framework as far as he thinks he could get it as an agreed document, he's found that he can't get it as an agreed document in as strong terms as he would like, and therefore he's begun to backtrack. You saw some of it just the other day when he suggested that the demand for formulation on a Jewish state might not be necessary. You can see some of the walking back of what might have been the tilt towards Israel in earlier versions or a weaker version. And when you get to a point where you have a deadline, April 29th, 30th, whatever it is, and people are expecting you to produce negotiations at that time, there is an urge to throw caution to the wind and get to negotiations. What I said earlier, and I really believe, is that it's better not to get to negotiations without strong terms of reference than to get to them with either weak or no terms of reference. Because you're guaranteed to fail with weak or no terms of reference. If you hold off a little bit and buy some time, maybe you can think of something better to do, hopefully a stronger framework.
Thanks. Gaith, on the issue of Palestinian politics as they relate to negotiations, many people say, well, it's now or never really, because Abu Mazen is the Palestinian leader who's supposed to be identified with compromise and nonviolence and so forth. He's in the twilight of his career. If this can is kicked down the road, let's say by tabling a very strong framework and then leaving it to the parties to grapple with it over time, if Abu Mazen is not going to be around, will there be a Palestinian leadership capable of grappling with this in a constructive way?
Again, I mean, I would look at this at many layers, and let me kind of take a very, very broad view here and say that since I don't see any other solution to the conflict, and since, frankly, the history of at least the Palestinian political development since the mid-70s until the late 80s has been a history of, moving the politics to meet what they understood in 74, that there's no option but a two-state solution. I see ultimately that the Palestinians will get back to this, even after Abu Mazen. However, if I want to look at the recent Palestinian history, again, 74 to 88, the deaths, the suffering, the internal, the blood that was shed to get to that point, I'm not even talking about between Palestinians and Israelis, I'm talking about among Palestinians, will be a very costly price to pay for that. So this is, my general answer to those who talk about finding alternative to a state solution. I don't see it, and therefore I don't see us but coming back to it. In immediate political terms, it's a big question. It's a big question that relates actually to a bigger question, which is what is the future of Palestinian political life? And there is a lot of tension. I remember when Arafat was dying, when he died, of course, all of us were concerned and what have you, but we who were around the leadership circles, we knew that this is going to be a very smooth transition by two, into either Abu Ala or Abu Mazen, and either of them was of the same line. Right now, since there is really, I would say in the last maybe 5 years, there's been a shrinking of Palestinian politics. We see a lack of vibrancy in Fatah, partly because Fatah is losing, it's not clear on what it has to offer to its public, it's not clear on a message, etc. Partly because I think of Abu Mazen's own governance style, which did not create as much space for dissent as, surprisingly, Arafat did during his time. All of this has got us to a point of crisis in the Palestinian polity. So, as things stand today, if Abu Mazen were to leave the scene today, I think we will end up with whoever is going to be next will be, frankly, too weak to do anything. Whether it is peace, whether it is war, whether it is reform, whether it is whatever it is. You'll end up into a protracted fight into defining who's going to jump to the ascendancy. Which goes to argue, I still think that Fatah as a movement and the Palestinian people as a as a people, even though there's a drift away from the two-state solution, it's still the desired outcome. What they lack is organized political machineries to do that. So that's why I actually, in my opening remarks, I ended about talking about the issue of Palestinian political reform. Right now, the Palestinian political system, the body politics, is too fragile to be dealt with, and therefore I think this is in our interest in the United States, but it's also in the Palestinian interest and the Israeli interest, to focus on rebuilding legitimacy through building strong, credible governance institutions, whereby a Palestinian leader, even if they cannot point out to deliverables in the diplomatic sphere, at least can point out to deliverables in security and governance and opening up the domestic political space to ground their credibility. That's more important than who the individuals are, because there's a big, second tier, all of whom, at least ostensibly, are committed to a two-state solution.
Fascinating. I think that brings us to a close. Thank you very much for your participation. I'd like to give a hand to our panel.